back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jamison Cable, and we're going to continue our discussion with author Stuart Sanders about the Battle of Perryville. A lot of people may or may not know, you have the Union regiment or a Confederate regiment. Who, as far as like people, I guess, was there a lot of Kentucky people at Perryville or other states more or less?
More other states. I mean, there were, out of the troops who were engaged, I mean, there were more Kentucky regiments who were not engaged than were. Because, like south of town, you had my great-great-grandfather's regiment, the 27th Kentucky. You had the 1st Kentucky Cavalry, the Wild Riders, Frank Wolford's regiment were all south of town. But engaged in the fight, the unit that the bluegrass unit that sort of went through the worst part of the battle was the 15th Kentucky Union Infantry Regiment. They were actually posted on the extreme Union right flank, overlooking the Henry P. Bottom House, which is an incredible battlefield landmark. I mean, the house, it's privately owned, but it still has bullet holes through the walls because it was literally caught in the crossfire. Yeah, and, the 15th Kentucky ended up enduring, multiple Confederate attacks by multiple regiments, and actually 2 brigades ended up pounding that position. In addition, as the battle went on, a lot of the members of the regiment crawled into Henry P. Bottom's barn for shelter. And an artillery shell hit it, eventually caught on fire, burned a lot of those poor wounded men alive. The colonel of the regiment, Colonel Curran Pope, was from a prominent Louisville family. He was wounded in the arm, sort of finished the battle. Then when he followed the Union Army out of the state, he was actually at Crab Orchard and started feeling sick and went back to, his wife's relatives were in Danville, went there and died of typhoid. So, there are these incredible stories, but the 15th Kentucky really had a really rough time. And I'd encourage everybody to read. It's a book called The Battle Rages Higher by Kirk Jenkins, and it's a history of that regiment. It's a really good regimental history. He does a good job sort of explaining the regiment. His Perryville chapter is especially good, I think. But, out of the Kentucky troops who were there, sort of none endured such terrible fighting as the 15th Kentucky did.
Yeah. So if next thing I'll ask you, so you wrote 2 books on Perryville. How long did it take you, or how much?
Yeah.
How was that process? Because 2 books is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's hard for me to judge that because I ended up I'm always working on multiple projects, so it's sort of hard to figure out. But like the 3rd book that I wrote was my second Perryville book. It's called Maney's Confederate Brigade at the Battle of Perryville. That came out in 2015, but I actually wrote most of it in 1998, 1999. It sort of sat on my computer. Wow. And the reason I wrote it is because I ended up, one of the first battlefield tours I gave, I thought, I can do a battlefield tour. I've got this. I've read enough on the battle. And I went out there. It was with a poor class of, high school students from the Governor Scholars Program. And I completely, it was awful. It was a terrible tour. I completely flubbed everything. They were asking me questions. Yeah. I realized I was like, I don't know what's going on. So to sort of learn more about the battle so I could do better tours, I ended up essentially writing that book. Mm-hmm. And then in the meantime, I'd written a lot on the aftermath of the battle. And that book, my first book, Perryville Under Fire, sort of came about because in another sort of sadly humorous incident, I gave a talk in Frankfurt on Perryville. I was talking about sort of the movement of armies and the battle and the tactics and all this stuff. And this, the poor guy who invited me to do the talk was sort of snoring in the front row. And so I realized I need to find like a better hook to get people interested. And I ended up sort of, again, having an ancestor at Perryville who's a surgeon, working on Merchants Row, which is an 1840s commercial district where essentially every building was a hospital. I thought, I want to actually find out, is this true? Was every barn, shed, church, stable, business, private home in Perryville, were they really field hospitals? And so to sort of kind of feed my own curiosity and then also like do a much better job giving talks about the battle, I ended up researching sort of the aftermath. And I started giving talks on the aftermath. And when I was driving home one night after doing, actually talked to that same group years later in Frankfurt, I ended up sort of had a light bulb went off, said, you've got enough on the aftermath. There's a lot of good source material out there. So, why don't you try to write a book on it? So that ended up being my first book. And so I have a hard time kind of judging how long it kind of takes, to be honest. I've got a book coming out next year. It was about a duel that was fought in Kentucky during the Civil War between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian. And so that it sort of looks at the secession crisis and the evolution of violence in Kentucky after the war through the lens of this duel. And I started that book, probably 5 years ago, but I wrote my fourth book while, I sort of took a break to write the other book. So I have a hard time kind of judging, because I'm always sort of unfortunately jumping around from topic to topic. So that's a long way of me saying, like, I have no idea how long it takes. I tend to bounce around from subject to subject a little bit too much, but
you got them done.
Yeah, no, at least I eventually got them finished. But for me, I've always found it's sort of doing the research and doing the writing is sort of the way I get these stories straight in my head too. Yeah. And so that's kind of one reason I end up kind of doing it.
Well, you get caught, and I always kind of say, get in a rabbit hole on, a certain topic, and then you have to kind of stop and get on to something else. And then that one other, that I got on a big rabbit hole about the assassination of Goebel.
Oh,
and very, very compelling story, of course, a lot of research out there. But I had to stop after a while. Okay, I gotta let this lie for a while. Right. Get to looking at something else.
And actually, I work for the Kentucky Historical Society, and we actually manage the old state capitol, where Goebel was assassinated right outside of that. And as part of our museum collection, on display in our exhibit gallery, we actually have the coat that Goebel was wearing when he was shot, and we also actually have his bloody shirt as part of our collection too.
Wow.
And that's an incredible story that I don't think gets sort of enough attention as well. So I think hopefully listeners will kind of dig more into that story, just because it talks about another terribly violent time in Kentucky's history. When again you think we're divided now. It's sort of like we're not compared to what Kentucky was like, 1899, 1900, that time. So, and Goebel actually, he had actually killed a guy before he was elected governor. And,
on the street there.
Yeah, there was a bank cashier. He had said some pretty terrible things about a bank cashier in Covington. To keep it G-rated, I won't go into that story too much what he said about him, but they ran into each other at this, the cashier was coming out of the bank, Goebel was going in. They basically, were 4 feet from each other, pulled pistols, and Goebel shot him in the head and killed him. And, a handful of years later, was acquitted and was later elected governor. So, again, you ever think Kentucky's crazy now? Just,
just rewind,
crack a history book. Yeah, and you'll know that we've definitely seen wilder times in this wonderful state.
Yeah. And we talked earlier about the book list. There's a Goebel book that I have that's on that list, and
me too. Yep.
Honestly, it's one that I'm putting. I kind of, I don't want to get into it because I know if I read it, it's I'm just going to go right down the rabbit hole again. Because you talk about ancestors and so forth, it's more of a family, legend. Supposedly, my great grandpa. It might be I think it's my great grandpa or my great grandpa on my maternal grandmother's side was one of the people from Eastern Kentucky, Barberville, and Pineville, who rallied up and went to Frankfort after during the whole assassination and all that kind of stuff. They say he was involved in it or whatever, but that's proven. I have no idea.
He rode the train up to Frankfort.
Yeah.
So, do you have a lot of Pineville roots?
A little bit, through my maternal grandma.
That's same here. My maternal grandmother was from Pineville, so
cool.
Yeah, that's where she was from. Yeah. So it's always fun to find Pineville connections.
Yeah. Hendrickson is my maternal grandmother's last or maiden name, I should say.
Nice.
So yeah,
that's cool.
Well, anyway, back to Perryville.
From Pineville to Perryville again.
So I mean, how big of a town was Perryville? Because I mean, this not big. I mean, Danville is bigger than Perryville now and then. But we're talking about a pretty small town.
Yeah, 300 inhabitants basically. Only 300 people live there. And so again, you're this town of 300 people. You've got surrounding farms that, in western Boyle County that, expands that population, but you have roughly 80,000 soldiers tromping through your fields, drinking your
That's
well
crazy.
dry. It's nuts. And, after the battle, again, you have 7,500 men killed and wounded. You have thousands of sick soldiers. So what does that mean for the town of Perryville? As I mentioned before, every building with essentially a roof became, and, fields too became field hospitals for all these troops. And, Perryville was completely overwhelmed. There's no medicine. There wasn't really enough chloroform during amputations. So there were hundreds of amputations that went on without any sort of anesthesia. And, the community was economically overwhelmed. And I mentioned Henry P. Bottom earlier. And he's one of my sort of favorite, kind of quote unquote characters from the battle, historic figures who was part of it. Because again, he was this farmer, local justice of the peace who lived in this, great house in this sort of quiet valley that ended up being the Union right flank at the battle. And, soldiers essentially swept his land clean. And as a result of the battle, he lost 9 cows, 30 sheep, 2 horses, 22 tons of hay, thousands of pounds of pork, thousands of pounds of bacon. And the list just sort of goes on and on. And, for the first time ever, Bottom had to buy food to eat. The family had to buy food for the first time because they were such a self-sufficient family. And after the war, they tried to get reimbursed for damages. They were seeking, in today's dollars, what would be $80,000 to $90,000 worth of reimbursements. During his lifetime, Bottom never received a penny. And he was actually responsible for burying a lot of the Confederate dead because the Union Army refused to bury the Confederates after the battle. And so Bottom and a number of slaves were impressed to bury the dead. Sort of other Southern sympathizers were forced to bury the dead. But Bottom buried most of them that were on his farm, in 2 large sort of pits. And that became kind of the genesis for, the Perryville Battlefield State Historic Site, because, that sort of grew around that Confederate cemetery. But Bottom was 45 at the time of the battle, lived to be about 90 years old. And when he was trying to get reimbursed for damages, he had died, then his heirs were trying to get reimbursed. His children were trying to get the money back. And during the testimony, Bottom's family physician was asked, did Henry P. Bottom ever recover from the Battle of Perryville? And, this attorney who asked the question was sort of seeking an economic answer. Did he ever recover financially? But that's not how the doctor took it. The doctor took the psychological answer. He said, no, sir, he never did. He was broken in spirit from that time on until he died. And so, you have this massive psychological toll that happened across the community, as a result of the battle. And Bottom just had a pretty rough life. His mother, who lived, several hundred yards away from his house, she was murdered in 1866 and, just had a terribly rough life and, essentially sacrificed so much and, just had a very rough time. But, you have stories like this all over the place at Perryville, with families suffering terribly as a result of the battle. And, in Danville, which you mentioned too, Danville had about 4,000 residents in 1862. Same thing happened because there were, in terms of every building became, or not every building, but most public buildings, churches, businesses became hospitals because the Union Army left about 3,500 sick Union soldiers in Danville. So, again, you have a population of 4,000, 3,500 sick Union troops there. The population of town almost doubles as a result of, all these sick soldiers being crammed into different buildings. And they were, one quote, there was one church, they had 128 patients in there, 128 sick Union soldiers. The doctor sort of counted them, went in the next day, and I think, about 60 had died the previous night. So, mortality was extremely high at the time. And so, what do people do? What do they do with the bodies? What do they do with the dead horses? I mean, it's really tragic. I mean, in Danville too, they talked about how, the quote, dreadful camp disease started spreading to civilians as well. So you had, civilians who ended up dying from typhoid and other illnesses as a result too. So, these poor townspeople, not only were their lives overturned, but then they ended up, their health was affected, their psychological health, their physical health, and, people actually died as a result.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. That's a pretty amazing little. You don't think about those things. I mean, everybody wants to talk about the soldiers battling, Confederate Union or whatever. But I mean, in a way, those people's lives were ruined in a sense. Or just took on such a hard burden after the war or after that battle. Even it wasn't even the war; it was just the battle.
Well, you think about what were these farmers' fields have looked like after the battle? I mean, not only dead horses, but you have, blankets and backpacks and muskets and bayonets and, shell fragments everywhere. And, that's why, for years, people, if they, walk through back in the, probably prior to the 1980s, you walk through a plowed field in Perryville, you're going to stub your
You can find
toe on a
something.
shell fragment. And so, farmers would just plow fields and they would just sort of throw, there's stories of, farmers who had just sort of buckets full of, bullets and, you know, again, pieces of artillery shells and all
Cannonballs.
sorts of stuff. Yeah, seriously. And,
Yeah.
and that's sort of something nobody thinks about either. Like the years it would have taken just to clean up, that end of the county. One interesting
Yeah.
kind of, this is kind of, don't listen to this podcast if you're eating dinner, from what I'm going to tell you. But, a sad reality that happened after the battle is that local hogs were out sort of roaming the fields too, and they were rooting up bodies and, consuming
gosh.
dead soldiers. I mean, terrible, terrible circumstances.
Yeah.
And so the same thing happened after the Battle of Richmond too. And the story is that basically after Perryville, after Richmond, nobody would buy hogs from Boyle County or Madison County. So the market basically bottomed out of the hog market, because there were nobody would buy any of these hogs. And so, there was such an influx of pork at that time that, the prices really plummeted. So it's this sort of unforeseen circumstance of these battles that are really brought about by, awful, terrible circumstances.
Wow.
And when you read the soldiers' accounts, you go into this stuff, it's pretty chilling and pretty terrible. And I think, we have a really hard time imagining just what it must have been like, for the small community, 160 years ago.
Well, think about a movie you may have watched or so forth, and as gory and bad as like, The Patriot or any of those kind of movies that you see, that it leaves out the whole other aspect of it,
Right.
The local people having to endure afterwards.
Yeah.
So.
And Saving Private Ryan came out when I worked there, actually. And
Mhm.
so in that, incredibly, graphic scene at the beginning, I was actually thinking about Perryville the whole time. I wasn't thinking about D-Day. I was like, it was sort of I had a real visceral reaction to it. Because, I'd spent, that day on the battlefield. And, you sort of get this sense of like, oh, this is a better visual representation of what sort of carnage would have looked like, and so for me, it was a very moving experience seeing that movie just because I worked at the battlefield at the time. So, yeah.
I guess to wrap up on Perryville, reenactments are pretty much. I know COVID, of course, bottomed out all reenactments for a while there, but back on schedule.
I think so. Yeah, it's every October, and so they're planning a pretty big reenactment this year. So if people are interested in visiting, they can check out. The Kentucky Department of Parks has a website with a Perryville page, and there's also too. I want to give a plug to the Friends of Perryville, which is a great sort of kind of support. They support the battlefield by providing things that the park might need, whether it's split rail fencing, interpretive signs, cannons, things like that. So if you're able to donate and help the Friends of Perryville, you can just search them on the internet and find them. I mean, they are wonderful stewards of that park and are great stewards of donations too. And, the money really goes to really improve Kentucky's largest battlefield. And so they're involved with the reenactment a lot of the time too. And, it's a great event, that brings a lot of people in for not only, to watch the reenactment, but also they have educational programs and, other programs throughout the day.
Obviously, Kentucky History Podcast is very much in supporting any kind of Kentucky history and so forth. But go try out reenactment if you have. Have you ever reenacted before? Or
I never did. The bug never caught me. When I worked there, I was always sort of working the event. Kind of promoting preservation efforts and doing things. So just never had the time to really try it. So, but I have lots of friends who do it and really love it. And for them, it brings sort of a connection to the field in a lot of interesting ways. And admittedly, at night, walking around the battlefield of the reenactment when I was working there, we'd have kind of be wrapping things up for the night. And there's a definite creepy feel when, you're hearing sort of, soldiers marching around and, the musket straps sort of, jingling and things like that. Sort of the sounds, at least, kind of connect you to that battlefield too at that time. So it's pretty neat. Encourage people to at least go see it once and kind of experience, Boyle County, visit the Ephraim McDowell House and visit other historic sites when you're in that area.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, you could just about, if you started at, say, Crab Orchard, William Whitley House,
Oh yeah.
and you could make a stop. I mean, there to Harrodsburg if you
Yep.
went. I mean, of course, you'd have to take a little bit of a left to get to Perryville, but
Right.
almost a straight shot of Kentucky history and so
Oh
forth.
yeah.
Stuart, it's been a great discussion having you on here. We've talked about kind of three of your books, but you have another book too, "The Murder on the Ohio Belle," which isn't about the Civil War at all. We'll have to have you back on, talk about it. But anything you want to add or throw out there to people about that book, real quick?
Well, yeah, it essentially looks at Southern honor culture, kind of interpersonal violence, and also vigilante justice through the lens of a murder that took place on a steamboat in 1856. So, kind of looks at a couple of these murders that happened on this boat that was called the Ohio Belle. And it kind of traces the history of what happened to the different people involved. And it's again, it's another true story that has some kind of grim connections to violence and murder, and was an interesting one to write and research.
All right. Well, we will definitely have to have you come back on the show again.
I'd love to.
Uh,
Thanks.
talk about it as well because, well, I mean, it's Kentucky history, and
Yeah,
we can go on for days about that. But
no joke.
yeah. um, Thanks again for coming on. Anything
Thanks for
else?
having me. I just really appreciate you having me, and again, thanks for doing the show. Really appreciate it.
We'll keep it going. Thanks for coming on, and for everybody out there listening, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.